in overtime, Kyle Shanahan took the ball first. Many people are criticizing him for it. He was asked about it after the game, and here's what he said.
With the new rules for overtime, what goes into the decision to take the ball first there?
It's just something we talked about with, none of us have a ton of experience of it, but we went through all the analytics and talked with those guys, and we just thought it'd be better. We wanted the ball third. If both teams matched and scored, we wanted to be the ones who had the chance to go win, and we got that field goal, so we knew we had to hold them to at least to a field goal, and if we did, then we felt it was in our hands after that.
Ryan, I laughed about it during the game, late during the game, because I think that the new overtime rules are confusing. And I noticed that Michael David Smith, our old colleague from Fan House, actually wrote a "What Are the Overtime Rules" story for Pro Football Talk. Do you think that John Breach had a "What Are the Overtime Rules" story for CBSSports.com?
You had to have, right, John?
I did.
Yeah, of course you did.
Of course you did. So, Breach, what are the new overtime rules? Because I think people are still confused about them, despite seeing them take place in the overtime during Super Bowl 58, Superb Owl 58 last night.
All right. Most importantly, both teams get at least one possession. So if the 49ers had scored a touchdown, the game would not have been over. The Chiefs would have been guaranteed a possession. I think that part is pretty clear. The second part, this is where I saw the most confusion, whether this was on Twitter, whether this was just talking to people over the past 24 hours, getting texts, is that the clock did not matter. If the Chiefs had not scored on that final play with 3 seconds left, time would have run out in the quote-unquote first quarter, first overtime period. They would have taken a quick break. They would have flipped sides. They would have started the second quarter of overtime, and then they would have kept playing. So the Chiefs would have got – the second team gets to finish their possession no matter what the clock says. So the clock does not come into play there. If the Chiefs had kicked a field goal on that series, it would have gone to sudden death overtime, which is what Kyle Shanahan was talking about, that they called, they wanted the ball first because they wanted the ball for that third possession, which is where you win it on a field goal in the sudden death portion. So those are the three main rules.
So knowing that, and I guess I'm sort of thinking back on the 4th and 1, where it was a 4th and 1 or 4th and 3, where the Chiefs went for it on 4th down in overtime. They were out. Were they outside of Butker's range? Like clearly outside of Butker's range?
Brent, I'm glad you brought that play up, because I think that is really the key to this whole thing. They were in their own territory at that point. They were at their own 34-yard line.
They obviously couldn't punt, right? Like,
correct.
You punt, you lose.
Because they're trailing. But if they had gotten the ball first, you're punting there. You don't have a choice. Like, that's the difference right there. If you get the ball first, you have 4th and 1 of your own 34. You are punting, because if you don't get it, the other team's already in field goal range, and they can win it with a field goal. Whereas if you are the team that has the ball second, you're going for it there because you don't have a choice. So that, I mean, to me, that one play was the huge kind of the play you can point to why having the ball second is more important.
Wilson, do the wins over Wilson analytics, have they properly calculated how bad Kyle Shanahan's mistake was and whether it was a mistake?
Yeah, I don't think it was a mistake. I understand what he's saying when he does the math, that he wanted the third possession. He was working under the assumption that it would score first. And they were steamrolling the Chiefs early on in that game, mostly with Christian McCaffrey. And it's not unreasonable to think that they could have scored a touchdown there. And by the way, Juwan Jennings was open. The problem is they didn't block Chris Jones on that final play where they had to settle for the field goal in overtime. So if they just block Chris Jones, and that seems like a pretty important part of any sort of game plan, Brock Purdy would have had time to get the ball to Juwan, who had won on a little return route, I believe. So I get it. I understand what he's saying. And, some speculation last night on this podcast that Kyle Shanahan did know the rules. He knew the rules, it turns out, and they went through it with their analytics department. So I can see both sides. The point Breach makes, I get it. You're not going to go for it on 4th and 1 on your own 38-yard line if you have the first possession, unless you're Dan Campbell. And you would hope, and by the way, hope isn't a plan. You would hope after you punt it, you can slow up Patrick Mahomes, and that never seems to work. You have to score a touchdown there. And I think in addition to the 4th and 1 that Breach talked about, the inability to block Chris Jones is also something you can point the finger at as to why they didn't score a touchdown on that first overtime drive.
Now, it is worth noting that I believe Lindsey Jones of TheRinger.com was in the locker rooms afterwards, and Chris Jones, as well as other Chiefs, told her that, and I think they told other reporters this, that they had been practicing.
Brinson,
excuse me,
big cough coming. I saw it.
You saw the cough button though. That they had been practicing these new overtime rules since training camp. and that they had been anticipating the possibility of having this situation unfold. And other 49ers players made it seem like they were a little less clear about the rules. I'm not saying I'm not like Kyle Shanahan is one of the all-time great coaches. I'm not suggesting that he didn't know the rules. I just think that in the moment, as it's all unfolding the way it did, that the Chiefs definitely were more confident in their game plan and what they were going to do. And you can go back to the, what is Bill Belichick, when Belichick and the Patriots won all these games, and also like an old Bill Walsh line about if you're the one who's keeping a calm head when things are getting crazy, you don't need to like elevate your game. You just need to maintain your cool. And generally people will lose it around you more often than not in these situations. The Seahawks and the Patriots, the end of that game being a decent example. And I think you can at least make the case, Wilson, even though with your sardonic remarks there, that there was like a little bit of Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers not being as cool and as prepared as the Chiefs were.
Yeah, I mean they faltered under the moment. I don't think that means they didn't know the rules. I just think that I would imagine Kyle Shanahan is perpetually prepared, but this isn't the first time he's shrinked in big moments, especially in the Super Bowl.
I'll say one thing real quick, and it's that it doesn't make any sense to me to be playing for this imaginary third possession. This is like me if I told my wife, hey, you know what? If we ever have $50 million, we're going to go buy a mansion. That's a great promise. But if we never have $50 million, that promise doesn't mean anything. It's just, so you're playing for this possession that might not ever happen. And you look at what are the options in overtime? If you get the ball first and you punt, now the Chiefs just need a field goal to win. They have Patrick Mahomes and one of the 3 best kickers in the NFL. If you kick a field goal, now the Chiefs can go drive a touchdown to win the game. If you score a touchdown, I think Chris Jones said in that same Ringer story that Andy Reid pretty much said they would go for 2 in that situation to make sure the other team didn't get a third possession. So the Chiefs would have done everything possible to make sure a third possession didn't happen. So in that case, it just seems like it favored the Chiefs by far to have the ball second.
Here's the quote. We talked through this for 2 weeks, Jones said, and this is again from theringer.com and Lindsey Jones, who's a great writer and editor over there, how we was going to give the ball to the opponent. If they scored, we was going for 2 at the end of the game. We rehearsed it. This is Lindsey now writing. The 49ers did not do the same. Multiple San Francisco players said after the game they were not aware that the overtime rules are different in the playoffs than they are in the regular season, and strategy discussions over how to handle the overtime period did not occur as a team. Defensive lineman Eric Armstead said he learned the details of the postseason rule when it was shown on the Allegiant Stadium Jumbotron during a TV timeout after regulation. Fullback Kyle Juszczyk said he assumed the 49ers asked to receive when they won the toss because that's what you do in the regular season when a touchdown wins the game. I guess that's not the case. I don't really know the strategy, Juszczyk said. Not a good look. Not a good look.
An interesting question here, though, that producer Harry mentioned, and I think it's really fascinating, is what do you think the breakdown would have been with other coaches in the NFL? Because keep in mind, this was the first time this overtime has ever happened because it's only in the playoffs. They only implemented it in 2022, and this is the first postseason overtime game we've gotten since they started it. So this was the first time any coach had to make this decision. Do you think most coaches would have taken the ball second and that Shanahan's the oddball, or do you think that they would have followed his steps and taken it first?
I think, and I know Seth Walter of ESPN said he talked to an analytics guy or analytics person from an NFL team who said if you polled NFL teams around the league, you would not get a definitive answer about what is the best thing to do in that situation because the imaginary third possession does technically come into play. Even though I agree with you, Breach, you can't hope is not a strategy, as Wilson likes to point out to us frequently. Having said that, I think most coaches would prefer to defer because this is the closest. We talked about this last night, but it's like the closest comp you can really come up with is the college overtime rule, where you start at the 25, and if you get the ball first and you get to fourth down, and you kick a field goal, the other team walks it off with the touchdown. So the Chiefs knew once they held the 49ers to a field goal, a touchdown wins it, and I think that played into their strategy. I would not be surprised if there's a discussion on the sidelines with the Chiefs and hopefully NFL inside the NFL or NFL Films or whatever comes up with it. But if there was one, that when the 49ers chose to take the ball, that the Chiefs were like, let's try and time this. If we get down to the end zone, let's try and time it with the end of the quarter if we can and a running clock, because it's going to throw everybody off, or at least some defenders off.
To answer your question, Breach, Dan Campbell's taking the ball first. He's scoring a touchdown, and he's going for 2. No matter what.
I will say one thing, though, that I think it took 40 years, 50 years, but I think the NFL finally hit a home run with their overtime rule. This seems like the right decision. Obviously, you don't want to do this in the regular season because you don't need to drag out games, but for a game to have guaranteed each possession, this is exactly what you want. It made it a thrilling overtime. Nobody is arguing about it being unfair, about the coin toss going one way. It is just, did Kyle Shanahan make the right or wrong decision? That's what we're arguing about instead of the unfair rules of overtime. So I think the NFL finally has gotten overtime right.
Well, and to your point, Breach, if the 49ers score a touchdown, kick the extra point, and then the Chiefs go down to the other side, score a touchdown, go for 2, and do not get it, we are having a very, very different did somebody bleep up discussion, and it involves Andy Reid and going for 2, even though I think we all agree that we like the idea of trying to put the ball in Patrick Mahomes' hand to win the game versus, kicking an extra point to tie it up and then, trusting your defense to stop Kyle Shanahan's offense.
Yeah, I love overtime. I hope we see more overtime and more Super Bowls.